Hi there. My name is FarhadG, and for those of you that don't know me, I'm a med student at Northwestern. But this will be my attempt at breaking down what I think are the most foundational underlying concepts of approaching the Step 1 study period, as well as my overall scheduling and tips and tricks and techniques and all of that. I felt the need to make this because there are a great many guides out there, and a lot of them, in my experience, are overly detailed, overly prescriptive, and they're somewhat just intimidating to approach. And having reviewed a great many of them, and having been influenced by some of the educational materials provided by my own school, and having done some reading on my own, I found some pretty overlying generalizable concepts and techniques and stuff that I thought hasn't been really chronicled yet, hasn't been explained in a way to students that's approachable, easy to interpret and understand, and doesn't have all of the really intimidating components of some schedules that are extremely jam-packed with detail and or to the minute detailed, or are super prescriptive and say exactly study this and study that. And so you should know it is my intent with this video that this video be not only a primer, but really the only resource you should possibly need while approaching your step studying. However, that is very hypocritical of me to say, because although I intend it to be fully comprehensive, I still strongly believe in one doing their own research and finding the things that work for themselves. And I'll talk about it a little bit later, but I definitely recommend that this video should be but one stop on your journey to developing a fully comprehensive, dedicated Step 1 study schedule and method. Because I think it's important that everyone see the wide variety of things that are possible, and you choose and mix and match as you go for yourself. So before I go any further, I'm going to take a step to the side, and I'm just going to leave myself a moment to leave a menu of options here in case you want to skip around. If I've done a good job, hopefully they're there and you're clicking something. Or you want to hear the whole story through. So let me start off by telling you a little bit about who I am and the type of student I am and the type of students that I'm designing this video for. Unlike some guides, I'm not going to say this works for everyone, but I do think that this general approach will help those people who found themselves in shoes similar to mine. So one of the first questions I think would be appropriate for me to answer is, who am I? What kind of student am I? What were my preclinical years like? And who are you learning from? So again, I go to Northwestern University, and man, to be honest, my first 2 years were terrible. I was a very mediocre student, and I was basically around average to below average, and then sometimes near failure. What we call at my school marginal pass, all throughout first and second year. Towards the latter end of my second year, actually, I was very close to the failure line, but I never fully crossed it. And part of that is because I stopped following the school's lecture material sometime early during the second year. And part of that is just because I wasn't a very good student. My priorities were all over the place, and I wasn't spending the appropriate time being a good student. And so where does that leave us? Right, so when it came to the dedicated step period, or when it came to a little bit before that actually, I was not one of the students who was ferociously attacking Firecracker or UWorld every day, 10 or 20 questions, or I wasn't like a very heavy Anki card user. I was okay. I think sometime around late to mid-December, I guess this is for those people that are like, when do I need to start? Late December, really, I didn't really start until Christmas break. I mean, in late November and early December, I started beginning to, making a mental inventory of the things that, I should cover, of different people's methods or techniques, or that person said they're using this, I wonder if I should, things like that. People were making cram schedules and all kinds of things, and I didn't partake in most of that. I did, however, begin reading some of the materials out there. regard to STEP. And I can probably touch on those later. Now is probably not the best time. So I really started in winter break. We had about 2 weeks, and again, I wasn't really heavily, intensively studying. You know, I spent a lot of time with my folks, and I didn't really work all that hard. During the winter, I did some what I call low mental energy studying, and I'll touch on that a little bit more, but really all that looked like was just watching some Pathoma videos, watching sketchy videos, really trying to just do things that would not be too intensive, not too mentally demanding, things that were, you know, pretty simple to hop into and hop out of, you know, low activation energy type stuff, and just to kind of refresh my mind a little bit, you know, not a lot. During the last block of the school year, or last 2 blocks of the school year for us, I did okay. I continued to keep doing some of the low mental energy stuff that I will touch on later, and then we approached the actual dedicated period. Now, at my school, they gave us 7 weeks for dedicated, and then, you know, you're supposed to come back and start your intro to 3rd year and stuff like that. I was not someone who stuck to the 7-week schedule, and so I actually took a total of, I think, 9 or 10 weeks, which I know is more than most people, and so I know that a lot of people are sitting there thinking already, darn, my school only gives 6 weeks, you know, this guy's schedule won't work for me. Let me remind you that the intent with this video is for it to be as generalizable as possible. So I will be laying out a schedule that you can pare down in any direction. And for those of you that are thinking like, you know, my school might allow me to take some extra time, that's not a bad thing. If they do, think about it. It's not a bad thing. I'll have a whole section, I guess, where I talk about that later in this video. I moved back home for those, you know, 2-3-ish months, and I cut out everything that wasn't important. My parents cooked for me, they took care of the laundry and like my, you know, chores and things, and really all I did from morning to night was study, eat, go to the gym, sleep, and repeat, essentially. And so I would say one of the most important things probably to the viewer is figure out a system that will allow you to be the least distracted possible. I'm not going to waste your time telling you about all the apps or all the techniques you should try. You should have some productivity tips and tricks under your belt by now. So just do whatever you have to get rid of distractions. If it helps you at all, I really thought of the STEP study period as a period where I like socially died for 3 months. It's like my life ended and then I was reborn post-STEP, and like nothing that happened in the news or in the media or in the music world or, you know, anything that happened with my friends on Facebook, you know, I missed all of it. But I think, you know, to some degree that's part of the sacrifice. So at the end of the testing period, I took my test at the end of my 8.5-ish, 9-ish weeks, and I did pretty well. I scored a 250, which I recognize is pretty good. And so as a result, I told some friends about this method and routine and blah, 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 and it's gotten some pretty decent feedback from friends, and I hope that it can be of some help to you. So the type of person that will benefit from this kind of schedule and from my overall framework is one who's kind of like a big picture thinker. Again, I'm not trying to be prescriptive, I'm trying to give you the overall sense of how to study for this. And so this is for someone who likes some flexibility, likes to feel like there's some customizability to the schedule. I promise there's plenty of that in there. And I'll, you know, on the side also probably provide my own specific schedules, just because I think that will be useful as you develop your own. The schedule has 3 overall phases, and so as long as you kind of stick to that overall 3-step approach, then it should be fine. I will be sticking mostly to a goals and a concepts-oriented approach to learning. I know that's like really vague. What does that even mean? It means that when I do a question, I don't think about the specific fact or the one detail that I missed or I got right. When I look at a question, I look at a question and I assess the overall concept and sometimes the surrounding concepts. And so by that I mean, let's say for example I saw a nephrology question, and the nephrology question had to do with, I don't know, something specific about probenecid and its effects on the tubule. And so you might think that, well, the question is asking about probenecid's effect on the tubule, but I would actually take a step back, and think that it's actually to do with something broader than that. It has to do with transporters across the proximal convoluted tubule, across the PCT. And so that would be the concept around which I missed that point. Or maybe you'll look at it a little differently. Maybe you'll think about the concept being drugs that affect the tubule. And so that's another way of approaching it. The bottom line here is that when thinking about questions and answering things, never get caught in the trap of going, oh, I missed this question just because I didn't know that one tiny factoid. That may be true, but that's also a trap. You should identify the factoid and then identify the surrounding concept, and that's where you've demonstrated that you have a weakness. And so that's my concepts-based approach to thinking about what to cover. Yeah, so another thing I should probably say is that this video is not for really gifted learners. If you know yourself to be someone who like hears it once, you've learned it, or you read the book once, you've got it, and I know such people. They're not mythical creatures. They sit and lecture and they fold their arms, and at the end of 50 minutes they've got the material down. Those are gifted learners, and I think that those people might benefit from different systems of learning. It also implies they have a really good foundation by the time they've reached this point. I myself had a very poor foundation when I got to step 1, dedicated studying, and so I had a very different approach. And so, this is more for those people. Speaking of those gifted learners, there's like a subset of them that prefer to learn in a very lazy way, and I think I want to talk about that for a second. So some people are lazy learners in the sense that they don't want to think about their schedule. They don't want to think about what should I study today. They want that very prescribed method, or they would rather just start at page 1 of first aid and just read to the end, or start at question 1 of View World and just do it to the end and then do it again. That's really lazy. It feels effective, and it feels like a good way to go, and a lot of people do it. But those people who have success with that method, they typically have a very strong foundation already in place, so that when they start those summative 40-question blocks, it feels like they're already there. I'm working on a weak foundation. I have a lot of gaps to fill before I reach that summative spot. It's also lazy in the sense that you're not taking the time to identify your weaknesses or identify your gaps and to do targeted study and targeted review and targeted blah blah blah. So bottom line, if you prefer to study in a lazy way, hopefully you're gifted, or hopefully you found a really good prescriptive template for yourself. Do that. This video will probably not float your boat. And last thing before we get started, a lot of the heavy lifting and a lot of the, the philosophy, underlying philosophy of this learning system comes from one of the academic counselors at my own school. This is a shout out to Laura Dodo. Really, this whole system, everything that I produce up here is based off of her PowerPoints and her lectures on how to prepare for step 1. The science, the underlying foundations for how to learn and how to review in an effective manner, that all comes from her and her materials, so shout out to her. The only thing that I'm really doing here is I think that I'm retranslating in a way that's a little bit more practical and approachable for medical students, and has been filtered through someone who's gone through the process. I think that's important. So starting with the underlying philosophy upon which we'll build our entire system, point number 1, gotta be honest with yourself. The entire success of this system relies on the fact that you can identify your weak points honestly, without holding a grudge against yourself, and you work on those. You target all of your learning on those. You need to think a little bit, where am I shaky a little bit, or what are the things that I don't know yet, which we'll identify and we'll work on. There's a portion of the daily schedule every day that identifies that. If you're interested, actually, I think that it might help you to look at the 4 stages of learning. I think they're called Maslow's 4 stages of learning. And so really the goal is to move from maybe I can put a picture up. Go from these 4 stages, I'm just going to assume I put it up here, go between these 4 stages. You go from the phase where you don't know that you don't know, and then you go to the knowing that you don't know. That's pretty early step 1 studying. And then really trying to move to any of the later phases. Those are where you identify that, with effort, you have this material down. Another one of the foundational points I think, or concepts I'll use, and it's kind of a concept model for understanding the things that you're learning and for how you should learn and blah blah blah, is something that I think Dr. Matt Mike produced and put on the internet, and I saw it many years ago and it really stuck with me. And so I'm just going to put a link here to that page. It's the visual guide to getting a PhD or something like that, and its conceptual way of looking at how knowledge is produced and how you gain knowledge, I think, is very foundational, and I will refer to it frequently as I show you where you are on the map to gaining full competency. So the other point that I've put up here is minimalism. You're probably familiar with the acronym UFAPS. U World First Aid Pathoma Sketchy. I think I mentioned previously, it is kind of the gold standard for what you learn or what you should use as primary materials. And I know that during your preclinical years you probably saw a lot of other great books, or during your dedicated period you may find great websites and great other textbooks, and you may get the urge to add them to your study regimen. I felt that urge a great deal, especially as someone who had such a weak foundation. I kept looking for new primary sources to add to my learning. That's really an exercise in futility. Unfortunately, you will find that there's so many great materials that you actually won't be able to get through them all. I would say that I wasted a lot of time in my first couple of weeks of studying trying to incorporate other textbooks where really U World First Aid Pathoma Sketchy is all I needed. So I would say, as a very general, but also pretty much stick to it rule, try to stick to the main sources. I will add a couple of extra sources, but really those are just extra sources of what I consider tertiary material or review practice material. And I'll mention those later, but try and stick to the main skeleton framework and you'll pretty much do fine. So as I was saying, this is a test of reasoning. Individual facts will be tested, but they are the bare minimum. You're expected to come into this test. And so really the hard work of the exam is the reasoning across concepts and the synthesis of sometimes new material. Let me give an example I think that exemplifies this. And this is a bit of a pop culture reference, but hopefully I'm not reaching too far out there for most people. For those of you that have seen The Karate Kid, you may remember a quintessential famous line that was the wax on, wax off thing. And wax on, wax off in the movie Karate Kid was essentially the way for the student to practice this very basic motion that had extremely generalizable capacity. And so the kid practices this all the time, and what ends up happening is that this serves, as this is going to look silly on camera, this serves as a blocking and defense method that was really, really good. There's also the pour the tea punching technique, but I won't get into that. What ends up happening is the kid goes to the tournament at the end and sees all these kids doing crazy backflips and crazy kicks and crazy moves that he's never seen before, and he's like, "Master, I can't do any of those things. I'm way outmatched." But his master assures him his expert mastery of the fundamentals of karate went very far for him. When kids came in with those crazy flying kicks, the basic wax on, wax off methodology of blocking and defending served him so well he beat the heck out of those other kids. And so the concept that we're trying to get at here, and I think this is actually generalizable to a lot of things, is know your foundation really well. Get the underlying concepts really well, because once you see something that you kind of have never seen before, you'll be able to extrapolate a little bit. So this is kind of one of the sage wisdoms I think that you can take from this video and probably apply it to your whole life, to be honest. Yeah, no, I feel confident about that. Probably to your whole life. Learn the foundation really, really well, and once you know what mastery feels like there, then you can dive into the specifics and hardcore stuff found elsewhere. So our system of learning is going to, as I've said, focus on the concepts and the basics over the miscellaneous facts. Yeah, and I want to talk about that. I don't want students to be afraid to slow down, to focus a little bit on those concepts that they feel a little rusty on. I think that there's a there's like a reflex bias that, like, you know, these little really low yield facts, and they're really arbitrary, like what's that thing, there's like definitely somewhere in the first aid textbook something about licorice being like I don't even remember, it's the low yield, but like licorice was involved in some type of pathophys, and it's like, do I need to know that? I don't know. Over time you'll get a sense of what things are high yield and low yield, and hopefully that'll work into your learning method. It'll take some time, but by the end of phase 1 and 2, which I'll describe later, you'll get a sense. For those of you who are aiming way above 250 or 260, you should know UFAPS is kind of regarded as, like, if you've got UFAPS down, then you will very comfortably get around 240 to 260. I'm going to say pretty comfortably. I'm sure there's like a more specific number somewhere. But anyway, for those of you who are aiming above 260, going for that 70s and 80s, does it even report at 80s? I don't even know. Then maybe those miscellaneous facts matter to you. And if so, this video may not be for you. Anyway, moving on. The next thing I actually just added is point number 3, progress is progress. I recognize that there's a bias towards just pushing on ahead and, you know, doing as many practice problems as you can per day and making sure you get through 20 pages no matter what. But sometimes people move so fast that they sacrifice their own learning and understanding, and I would like to speak against that. There is obviously a too much and a too little scenario here, but I will give you some of my heuristics. I would say overall, try to move as fast as you can without sacrificing your learning or understanding. Now, I know that's a big pullback. I am a very slow studier. I studied much slower than most of my friends. When I did that UWorld question that like challenged my understanding of the universe, I stopped and I would take a few steps back and identify the multiple concepts that I clearly lacked, and work forward from there. I would say that you can do that too much. You can slow down too much, that you're slowing down your overall progress, but I would err actually on that side. It's okay to slow down. Progress is progress. Anytime you are having non-zero movement, well, you're learning. And that's, I think, you know, part of the greater thing about being a med student. We're trying to learn this stuff, not just regurgitate it for a test. Unless in which case you are, then, you know, that's another situation. You know, a couple of different ways of saying this same thing. Progress is progress. You may have heard a quote, no pause, no hurry. Slow and steady wins the race. Keep them moving, you know, in reference to like your legs, keep moving, you know. Just whatever your mantra, whatever your philosophy, just progress is progress. Do not berate yourself. Do not feel bad if you're moving slower than your friends. Do not sacrifice the quality of your learning. You know, and so the last thing I would say about this progress is progress thing is that this whole thing, this whole period of time, this whole step 1 period of time, it's a marathon. It's not a race. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how you should think about taking breaks and studying in between and all that, so that you don't burn yourself out. I'll talk about that towards the end of the video. And so I think that pretty much closes out the full series of like philosophical underlying concepts, and we are now ready to hop into the meat. But first, some definitions. Okay, so there are, in my understanding of the world, 3 types of materials. The first type of material are primary materials. These are materials like first aid, pathoma, sketchy, boards and beyond, very high yield. Maybe the doctors in training videos or other things of that nature. Board review series, maybe even your school lectures, although I have some thoughts about that. I wouldn't recommend using these. They're very inefficient to work through, in my opinion. Maybe another video on that someday. But anyway, so these are more primary materials. Your secondary materials will consist of things that you use for review. This is, in a sense, your condensed version of the learning materials in a language you understand. They're your review sheets, they're your flashcards, they're your Anki decks, they're, you know, whatever you use. I want to make special mention of this quit messing up sheet. I think that early on in your study period, you will probably start to identify concepts that, gosh, you just keep messing up. Things that no matter how many times you seem to see a question on, you always forget, and it's something ridiculous. This quit messing up sheet is in service of that. You identify those, and then at some point during phase 2, I'll tell you about it later, you'll come back at it with a vengeance. For me, that was things like paraneoplastic syndromes, heme-onc, cancers, breast pathology. Awful at breast pathology. I've never gotten it, don't understand it. To this day, I've already forgotten it again. Those are my quit messing up type things, and so we'll talk a little bit about how to tackle those a little bit later. And then there's tertiary materials. These are your practice materials. These are the things that help you consolidate. They're the practice questions. They're the most well suited to identify your weak points, to make you practice, to practice recall, retrieval. Honestly, although I knocked it a little bit earlier, those lazy learners and those really highly efficient learners, I mean, if you had to do nothing else, let's say for some reason in the universe you have no other materials and all you have are tertiary materials, questions are king. Tertiary materials are where it's at. They are the best at helping you learn, helping you identify your weak points, and helping you, sometimes service narrow concepts around the thing you missed. So when you get that UWorld question wrong, did I even identify these? UWorld, which as you know is gold standard in terms of practice question sets. It's better than both Kaplan and USMLE RX. I didn't put Kaplan above USMLE RX for any reason. They both have their pros and cons. Some people like one, some people like the other. Try both if you want. I don't know. So long as you don't run out of questions, it really is the point. Just as long as you have enough questions to keep refreshing yourself. Other sources, I've put these in brackets only because they're not prototypical resources most people use, but I feel quite strongly about them, and I'll talk about them more specifically when I'm covering the 3 phases. These are Goleon's Rapid Review Pathology question sets, the First Aid Q&A books. These are also easy questions that are centered on like specific nitty comments, but again, nitty concepts, but they'll identify for you the things that you know and don't know. And then there's the FC is for Firecracker. First, Firecracker cases and like practice cases. Yeah, those were not the best and often messy and stuff. They helped me a little bit. You don't have to use them. If you don't have them, above the brackets, essential, needed. But the general 3 phases will move from one set of materials to the next type of materials. So in the first phase, when I discuss it, you will be a lot of time, using primary and secondary and some tertiary materials. By the time you're in the second phase, you'll be spending more time with this and less with this and more with this. And by the very third phase, the last phase, you will spend almost all of your time with these summative, linking, concept retrieval, recall, questions that put you in the zone. I am riffing here. Overall, you will tend towards this direction towards the end of your study. And so that's a general principle you should keep in mind as you study. In a study of students who were given some material to study and then tested at a later date, those students who only learned by reading a primary material source only had a recall of about 25%. Those students who learned only by practice questions, I believe they got around 50% recall. And those students who learned by a mix of both reading and learned practice problems, those increased up to, I think the number is 65%. And so what's indicated here is that if you have nothing else, once again, do the practice problems, the tertiary type of materials, but ideally you do some of both. But really the lesson here is don't just be one of those people that just reads. It's passive, it's not active enough, and it will set you up for some failure. Okay, so I think we finally have talked enough about the concepts and the underlying methodology to finally approach the schedule itself. How have I divided up the board? So over here is the overall schedule. Up at the top is the pre-dedicated period. That's just everything above the schedule. You'll notice that the schedule is broken up into just generally 3 phases. And as I've told you, I'm not planning on being super prescriptive here. We'll talk about what goes into these 3 phases a little bit more in detail very soon. Some of the things you'll see in here. There's a planning section. The first couple of days for me were just kind of getting like a feel of like what I wanted to do. It's okay if that takes some time for you. Ideally, you do as much of that in the pre-dedicated period as possible, but it doesn't happen for everyone. Then there's this very last ominous box here. That's test day. That's TD. And above that are T1 and T2. That's test 1 and test 2, and I'll talk about those when I'm in that section of this video. And then I've broken up the board into just a few sections: the pre-dedicated period, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So let's talk about this pre-dedicated period. So in the pre-dedicated period, which is like right now-ish, a lot of medical students are starting to freak out. They're seeing their friends starting to study. They're like, oh my gosh, I should be doing UWorld 20 questions a day, or redoing all of Bro's Encephalon or Zonky or whatever the cool Anki card deck of today is. And it's, I don't know. I didn't do any of that. In my pre-dedicated period, what I did was I identified things that were very low energy for me to start studying. I like, a low activation energy to start studying. Like, how when it's like, ugh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to get my books out or pull up those, whatever. Or like doing UWorld questions is kind of intimidating, especially at the start. So like you kind of don't want to do that. I mean, if you do, you do. But I didn't. So what I did was I found some low activation energy material that I could do every day without feeling awful about. And for me, that was watching Pathoma videos while I ate, and doing sketchy videos, again, while I ate, or just a few in the evening. And that was my way, actually, of hitting all of the Pathoma and sketchy videos, just one time through, just to rebuild familiarity. I wasn't planning on becoming an expert during this time. I'll talk a little bit about where you should be, mentally in terms of knowledge in a second, a schematic over here. But you just want something that's easy, do a little bit every day. This is also a great time to identify your weaknesses. So I know like it's the medical student thing to say like, oh, I suck at everything, or I'm really bad everywhere. But the fact of the matter is you're probably not. Probably the things you did more recently you have a better grasp on, or maybe you were like me and you were very lost in life when pulmonology was going on, so you had to relearn that from scratch. I don't know, I did. Or maybe you're just like a morally gray person like me and you're really bad at ethics. Whatever it is, you identify the things that you're most awful at. Fine, you can be bad at everything, but the things you're most awful at. One thing that Northwestern does that I think is really appreciated here is that the school forces us to take the Basic Science Self-Assessment Exam or something like that, CBSSA, I think that's I don't know. But it's essentially a NBME exam that is kind of like the real thing, and it allows you to see where would you be at if you took it today. And that helps our students because A, it helps identify weaknesses, but B, it also lights the fire under their buttons and lets them know they need to get started. They do that in like January, February. So, my classmates, it'll happen. Wait for it. What else is important? I think it's a good time to start doing some pre-planning. Do some reading online. I did like a lot of Googling while, very anxious and stuff in like November, December, reading different people's like step 1 study schedules. Like if you need some keywords, just go to Google and type in the words, best step 1 study schedule. If like you don't get 30 student doctor network forums to read, then you're doing something wrong. Or add student doctor or add Reddit to your keywords, and you'll see a lot of things that come up. There's a lot of powerhouse, a lot of well-known students who've written up their experiences and their overall plans, and read through those. Not like don't take meticulous notes, but read through a lot of them. I would say I read through maybe at least 10 or 15 different people's plans. And that seems like overkill, and honestly it probably was a little bit, but I kept looking for that golden nugget. But at the end of that, what I realized was everything works. And I think I'm going to pause and let that sink in. Everything works. At the end of the day, what mattered was that the students identify what they were bad at and threw themselves wholeheartedly at the approach and the filling of those mental gaps. It didn't matter if they did 500 questions a day or 100 questions a day. That stuff doesn't matter. All that does matter is that they study the things that they were bad at in a way that was comfortable and maintained forward progress for them overall. And so if you want to take my word for it, then fine, do that. But I still recommend doing a Google around because you'll probably want to mix and match some methods. One other thing I'll mention is that my school has like an academic support type page, and on that page it kind of says, here are academically successful students from Northwestern in the past, and here are their tips, tricks, techniques, and study plans. Again, looking through those just identified really that there is a variety of things that work. And so, bottom line, do something that works for you. In the midst of this rambling, I remembered something very important that I want to tell you, which is the following. A lot of those really gifted learners or a lot of those really lazy learners will say something that I think I've actually said too. Questions are king. And they'll put all their focus on studying, without any of these phases. They'll kind of just jump ahead to the phase 3 that I'll describe in a bit, which is mostly just doing practice problems all day long. And, what guides that is if you spend any time looking at the internet of students who talk about step 1 and the things that correlate with good step scores and stuff, there's a small but sizable, it exists, it's empiric and a little above empiric, amount of evidence that says that students that do more practice problems do better on the exam. Well, okay, I guess that makes sense to some degree. If you spend more time, if you do a lot of questions, then you'll do better. And I think that foundationally makes sense, and so a lot of students hang their hat on that, so to speak, and will just be like, I have to do all the questions, I have to do 5,000 questions, I have to do UWorld twice, and then do Kaplan as well, and that's unnecessary. I will tell you up front, I did not even finish UWorld. I did a total of probably 1,800 questions. So it didn't matter how many questions I did, so long as I was doing questions, I was learning from them. So I was not afraid to get a question wrong and then stop and then focus on those overlying concepts for the next 30 minutes. That didn't happen multiple times a day, but it happened from time to time, and so that's important. I think that this concept actually can be quite easily illustrated with example by extremes. Students that said, if a friend of yours came up to you and was like, oh my gosh, I did 4,000 questions, and you were like, what? In what period of time were you able to do 4,000? And then they say to you 4 days. You would probably think to yourself, wait, 1,000 questions a day? That doesn't make any sense. To do 1,000 questions a day, you would almost literally have to be question, 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 answer, wrong, or right, a quick skim of the answer, yeah, okay, that makes sense, and then move on. And you would do that so many times, and would you retain any of it? No, but you would have theoretically done 4,000 questions a day. And so my issue with that variable for measuring success and student success on the road to mastery for step 1 is that it conflates so many variables, so many things that are hard to measure, which is why we have no data, like quality of studying, or amount of depth observed while studying, or number of YouTube videos watched while studying. All of these things, they're soft variables. There's no way to truly assess how well you are studying. So we hang our hats on the one quantitative variable we have, which is number of questions, which, as I've illustrated, doesn't necessarily mean anything. So again, I'll reiterate, if you feel the need to slow down to make sure you get the material, then do it. It's not a problem. Okay, let's return back to this. Where was I? Yeah, everything works. Read things online. Do some planning beforehand. And I think things will be all right overall. Where should you be at the end of a pre-dedicated period of time? There's no should actually really there. It's where are you? So where should you be at this period of time? If you looked at that Matt Might guide to getting a PhD thing, the kind of visual method for explaining where you should be will look a little something like this. Imagine this line as all of the knowledge you've obtained until you were a little pre-med. And up here, this line is step 1 knowledge. And we'll say that's the period of time that, you know, you're like a good M3. You're like ready for the clinicals, you're ready for the wards, you're ready. And so let's just say this line, and you know, the x-axis really doesn't mean anything. If anything, it means like the movement across different fields and disciplines. Just like, you know, it's not a perfect analogy, just let it happen. So let's say that you come into med school and you've got like, you know, your really basic understanding of how medicine works and stuff. And then, you know, we start building on that knowledge. We start giving you some medical school knowledge and some medical knowledge and blah, blah, blah. So let's say your school gives you that immunology, and you know, when you enter step period, wow, you have forgot most of it. Oh, okay, that's all right. Let's say then, you know, you did some micro, and hey, you were pretty good at micro, and you did hemonc pretty recently, and so you remember a good portion of that. And repro GU was like the worst time of your life, not only because you hate repro GU, but also because life was happening or something. And you know, you remember this part of GI, and you remember this of neuro, and you remember this from MSK and derm, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, obviously I have not covered every subject, but the idea here is this. You probably, for all of these different like concept areas, remember varying amounts. And that's okay. Hopefully you spent some of the pre-dedicated period, you know, just bringing them up a little bit. Not like a lot, not necessarily a lot, but you maybe focused on some of your weak points and you bring them up a little bit. As we dive into this series of 3 phases, you'll be able to guide yourself on what you should do next based on where you feel with your gestalt is on the approach to step 1 knowledge. I guess so I can introduce them. Where should you be at the end of pre-dedicated? I don't know, anywhere you want. It's going to be lumpy, bumpy, some things better than others. Hopefully you've helped bolster up some of your weak points a little bit. Okay. So I think I'm now ready to finally talk about phase 1. So welcome to phase 1. Phase 1 is the period of time known as the activation phase. The activation phase is exactly that. You're reaching back into the depths of time, pulling out all those things that you've forgotten, and you're reactivating them, or at least you're bringing them to the forefront a little bit. Where you should be ending at the end of phase 1, you should probably aim to be getting around, you know, let's say here. This is phase 1's target, okay? So you'll note that phase 1 doesn't demand mastery of anything. The goal for phase 1 is to kind of reach this general amount of familiarity with all of the material. You'll notice that it's, you know, not nearly all the way there. I believe that in our school's materials, the recommendation is to find that when you do like, I don't know, a set of practice problems on a topic, you're getting above a 65% correct on that practice problem set. So if I did 50 questions or 100 questions of cardiology, if I got 65% of those questions right, then I would say, okay, that's good enough for phase 1. So the general daily schedule across all 3 phases, in fact, is made up of a daily review, identifying weaknesses in some way, which we'll discuss as we go, then spending time to learn said weaknesses or learn whatever the concepts for the day are, and then to consolidate, be it with a set of problems or something targeting the things you learned that day. I'm just now noticing, actually, I haven't discussed the blocking thing about how, you know, you should target 1 block at a time. So let me take a moment on that. Phase 1 is the time to focus 1 block at a time. I found that I had a lot of really large weak points, and so I was spending multiple days on particular blocks. For the people that are thinking, why don't you just jump into, you know, 40 question summative right off the bat? The reason we don't do that is because so much of this early foundational building depends on you're seeing the same concepts over and over again so that you can, you know, build across them and build a familiarity with the block as a whole. The people that are jumping into 40 question summative right off the bat, they're going to see a question on dermatomyositis, and then their next question will have something to do with small cell lung cancer, and they aren't given the opportunity to connect across concepts. Whereas if you stay in cardio for the whole day, you'll likely in your consolidation period at the end of your day see something that, you know, refers to previous knowledge you learned that day. It's important for your consolidation and practicing that retrieval. It's It helps, trust me. So phase 1, you should be tackling one block at a time. So broadly speaking, phase 1 is a time to refresh all of the material. It's to find a comfortable familiarity with most of the concepts. So like, yeah, I've seen that before. Oh, I mostly get that. I could probably swing it, on a question if I saw it, and that's fine. And then I would recommend, this phase 1 is the best time to like just exercise your curiosity about, things. If you feel like now is a good time, go a little deeper. Find a New England Journal article maybe that'll help you learn a little bit better, learn it more concretely. Look broad and wide. If now is the best time to just scroll around YouTube or find other websites or find other people's explanations for certain things. This is the time to do it. Specifically, on a more specific level, what was I doing during phase 1? I was waking up at 9 a.m. every day, and from 9 to 12, 3 hours, I was doing what I called review. For me, that is Anki cards. I think Anki is amazing. I did a whole load of Anki cards. I used some, mostly cards that I made, but I also included some other decks, and I'll probably touch on those later. So I was doing a lot of review. Like, gosh, how many cards are you reviewing in those 3 hours? It depends from time to time. Sometimes the cards would demonstrate for me a major weakness, and so I would spend some extra time on that weakness and that weak point. At my fastest, I was probably covering around 300 cards in those 3 hours. So about 100 cards an hour was actually not bad for me. And I don't want to talk too much about what your cards should look like, but my cards were typically conceptual cards, not like, here's a rote thing you should memorize. If you've ever looked at Rosencephalon's cards, a lot of his cards are very rote and very quick and that's not bad. You should have a great number of those cards, actually. You've got to learn those things. But when I was making cards for myself, they were mostly of like a second order or conceptual type of thing. At 12 o'clock, I would do 10 questions. This was the identify my weak points phase of every day. So what I would do is I would open up UWorld or Firecracker or whatever I was using that day. I would do 10 questions in that block, and I would identify my weak points. I would do the weak points then, and then from 1 o'clock to 7 o'clock, I would spend time just learning, attacking those weak points. And I think this is best illustrated with an example. I think earlier I talked a little bit about the importance of using concepts to focus your learning. And I think this is best elaborated with an example problem. Let's say you did a question and it was about some guy, and he has a heart attack, and a few weeks later he rapidly decompensates, and it says, what do you think happened? Well, those of you who are already ahead of the game, you're probably identifying, ooh, previous heart attack, post-MI complications is the concept. So if I were a bad student, I might look at that question and be like, oh shoot, ventricular rupture, which is maybe what it is, I don't know, don't hold me to that. Ventricular rupture, that's what happened, I didn't know that. Ventricular rupture is something that happens after MIs, got it, and move on. You're cheating yourself. You should identify the concept at large, the surrounding concept, which is post-MI complications, and take time to study that. So maybe you get like septal rupture, or maybe you get the ventricular rupture, or you get a free wall rupture, or all of these different possibilities. You look at those concepts, the ones around it, and next time, later in your consolidation period, you're never going to see that exact same question again about ventricular rupture, but you will see the related concept, the question about someone having an autoimmune reaction a few weeks later, maybe because of newly exposed antigens, and oh my gosh, it's Dressler syndrome, right? So it's about studying the surrounding concepts, and that should take you a long time. I gave myself 6 hours every day to work on those things that I identify my weaknesses. Moving on, by the way, this is not like a strict schedule, sometimes it was past 7 o'clock, sometimes it wasn't, just feel it out. This is meant to be generalizable and adaptable for your needs. Sometime around 7 or 8 o'clock, my mom would bring me dinner, because I love my mother and she loves me, and she brings me dinner and I would do like 10 or 20 questions. I would like to note here that, again, this is not meant to be prescriptive. Some days I only did 5, some days I did more than 10, All that mattered was that I did some consolidating questions, things that attacked the same material-ish that I covered for that day. I mean, obviously I'm not gonna seek out specific questions that seek out the, that did the exact concepts I covered, but cardiology as a whole, I would do it. And I'll take a moment actually, and maybe stop. This here, right here, during phase 1 and later when I get to phase 2, this is where I implemented these. So Golian's rapid review, first aid Q&A, and like those firecracker cases. That's how I did these like consolidating questions, because these question sets are not detail oriented, but they're like simple. In a sense, they bring together, or they would help me consolidate or review the things I had just learned in like a simple, easy question stems, typically easy, like you know it or you don't know it type questions, and they help me once again identify the things that I was weak at, and maybe gave me an opportunity to practice the things I did earlier that day. Or again, if you don't have those materials, just do UWorld. It doesn't matter so long as you're consolidating in an appropriate way. So I would do this learning period, and then I would spend the rest of the night from 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, whenever I felt like I was done for the day, learning. I looked at the questions I got right, I go yes. I look at the questions I got wrong, I go no. Identify concepts, and learn. Okay, what is learning? Great question. So during these 6 hours of learning and these last 3 hours of the day, during those 9 hours of, man, that's a lot of learning. During those 9 hours of learning, what am I doing? Again, I've identified a concept, and I've gone back to my primary material. And because it's phase 1 and I have a little bit of extra time, sometimes I'll watch an Osmosis video. If you haven't found the Osmosis channel on YouTube, it's a really great channel, check it out. I'll go to the associated page in first aid. And remember, post-MI complications, I think has a whole page spread in first aid, so I would review that. And I would maybe, rewatch a Pathoma video, or go to one of my favorite websites I'll mention later, MedBullets, or Medicosum, I don't know how to pronounce it, I'm sorry if I'm butchering it. Links that I'll provide later. And so these were my way of attacking the concepts I was weak at from multiple angles, and then producing secondary review material. I would make myself a page, or I would make myself a flashcard so that I would see that stuff again the next morning during the review phase. Aha, that stuff comes back. That's good. And so that's what learning looked like. This was me really taking a relatively deep dive. Again, to the depth appropriate so that I wasn't slowing myself down too much, but that I was promoting my own learning and understanding and being like a curious med student and blah, blah, blah. Okay. At 11 o'clock, I would start to wind down and maybe have a glass of tea or play guitar or read a book or do anything really to unwind from the day. Around 8, 9, 10 p.m. I actually had never felt this before until step studying. I could actually feel when the sponge that is my brain was saturated. I was there, I could feel it some days. I was like, whoa, I can't fit another thing in here, I'm tapped out. So that was when the wind down and the sleeping would happen. In review, you start the morning, you do 3 hours of review. These are all of the review sheets and the Anki cards that you've made during phase 1, and we'll continuously add on. You will have hundreds and hundreds of cards by the end of this, I'm sure. You do some questions to identify your weak points, then you attack those weak points, and then you do some consolidating questions to review, and then you keep learning, and then you go to sleep. And that is phase 1. What else should I answer? Maybe some common questions. You'll ask yourself, when do I know I'm ready to leave phase 1? Remember this 65% thing? That's for you if you want to be quantitative, but for me, I'm a little bit more just feel for it. Just general familiarity. I think I already said that. How many questions are you doing per day? Like I said, I was doing maybe 10, maybe 30 a day. Not a lot. Again, feel free to modify. Something horribly wrong you can do is to say, I'm doing pulmonology today, and then open first aid to page 1 of pulmonology and then just start reading. That's very passive learning, and you're gonna do this thing. You're gonna be like, oh yeah, I remember this, Next page. You're rushed for time, so you won't give yourself the opportunity to do the deep dive, and you're taking a shotgun-esque approach. The reason we do this identifying weak points is so that you can kind of jumpstart that Maslow's like 4 stages of learning thing, you gotta recognize that you don't know, so that when you start reviewing it in the learning period of time, you're like, oh man, I thought I knew this and I got a question wrong about it. And so that'll light the fire under your butt so that you actually recognize how little you know. Another mistake you can make is think that you need to cover everything. Like I said, you do not need to start at page 1 of poem all the way through to the end. Everyone should be kind of adjusting phase 1 to their own needs. You can spend as much or as little time per block as you want. Again, the goal is general familiarity, feeling about 65% with all of the material. What to do with weekends. Is this the schedule for every single day? No, in fact. This for me was my specific schedule Monday through Friday. Again, one of the key things about my method is that I leave a lot of room for flexibility and adaptability. So what are weekends? Saturday and Sunday are those like flexible, do what you need to days. There were days I caught up on certain things. They were days that maybe I just did more review problems, or maybe I took an NBME, or whatever. So I gave myself 2 evenings off per week. I will emphasize this more later, but definitely make sure to give yourself some free time. For me, that was the weekends, gave myself the evening off. If you want like a specific schedule of what I did those days, I would still do my 3 hours of review. You gotta do that every day. You gotta maintain your knowledge of that stuff, you know, with the Ankis. And then I would fill in the gaps. I would focus on those concepts that I wanted to spend some more time on, or do the NBMEs, or do some set of summative problems, or do some just overall thinking and reevaluation of where I am in my schedule and my progress, and you know, holistic stuff. It's a catch-up day. Treat it how you will. So at the end of our last section, that was the end of the phase 1 activation phase, and you might be wondering where you should be now. So this was where we started, and at the end of phase 1, you've brought up, you know, most of your concepts just around maybe some gaps. Yeah, I'll leave that gap in there. You know, close enough. You know, some things you're a little bit more, and some things maybe not. You know, everything is kind of around that phase 1 line. Okay, so that's where you should be. What is phase 2? Phase 2 is a lot like phase 1. In general, it is more secondary and tertiary material, so you're going to find time to do more practice questions and more review type material. In general, you're going deeper, so we're moving beyond just having a general familiarity with everything. You're now trying to get into the nitty-gritty detail. You know, you need, if there are words about it in first aid, it is fair game for the exam. And many times I remember doing practice problems being like, there's no way this fact is in first aid, but there it was. So you're starting to get nitty-gritty. You're also giving yourself the opportunity to start connecting across blocks. And I think that's one thing that's really cool about this phase is that, okay, you've done cardio and you've done poem and you've done renal. What happens when you put them all together? So when you start doing practice problems, summative problems in this section, you won't have the benefit of knowing exactly what type of question this is. You'll be connecting across blocks. Certain blocks lend well to this, to be added together. I should also mention that it's also not a bad idea to connect blocks that you have varying strengths in. For example, if this is your cardio block and this is like your renal block, it's not bad to mix those two. You can keep practicing your really good cardio and also help bring in the renal, so bottom line is this: you're going deeper, you're doing more practice problems per day, and you're connecting across the blocks in a meaningful way. At the end of phase 2, you should kind of be here. You should kind of have touched the line for a lot of things, but you still have some gaps to work on, but you're kind of there. Okay? So phase 2, your goal is to get deep into the material, cover all the concepts, start getting really into the nitty-gritty so that you're finally and completely there. But you've still got some gaps, and we'll address those in the next section. What does a daily schedule look like in this phase? Still, I get up, it's still the same schedule. We're elaborating on it. It's a review in the morning, identify some weak thing that you want to focus on for the day, learn that thing for the day, and then consolidate with some practice problems. And so for me, I actually kind of had 2 different ways of doing that. On some days, always review for 3 hours, and then do 20 to 40 questions of those blocks I've identified to co-learn. and then identify my weak points, identify the concepts and the surrounding concepts upon which I will focus for the day, and then do that, make Anki cards, do that, and then hit the review phase. You'll note that you're doing more questions here. So if I was doing like 20 or 40 in the morning, I did another 20 or 30 at night, that's already about double what I was doing in phase 1. Again, this is the time I'm using these problem sets. I love going on's rapid review at this time. Again, the questions are really quick, they're to the point, and they point out my weaknesses fast. So I don't have to spend as much mental energy as I do when I'm doing like a full-on UWorld question. So I really appreciated having those questions at that time. No, I'm not being paid for this. Okay, and so the other way of doing this day is to do the 9 to 12 3 hours of review, and then go straight to the quit messing up pages. So earlier on in the secondary type of material section, I mentioned these quit messing up pages. These are those things that, since the beginning, you've identified that you just can't seem to get. No matter what, you keep getting it wrong, they always elude your understanding. This is the day. You come into this quit messing up section and you say, today, paraneoplastics. I 100%, this is not a joke, I spent 4 hours on paraneoplastics in one day. I did the deep dive on paraneoplastics that day. So those are the two general frameworks for how to do the phase 2 stuff. And again, phase 2 is that period of time you're trying to get fully all the way up to that area of knowledge, all the way up to that step 1 perfection. Still some gaps to go. You're trying to move away from primary materials at this point. You're starting to dive deeper and harder into secondary and tertiary materials. Connect across concepts. You're starting to gain familiar with how the questions work, how to identify the key parts of a question, and so you're actually moving faster through questions as well. I'm kind of intentionally vague in this section. There's really not a lot to change. It's just more and deeper. Is essentially what phase 2 should be. It's flexible on the weekends. This is probably where I started taking NBMEs, and I'll talk about those at a later time. Yeah, I think that's pretty much that. Welcome to phase 3. So when we left off at the end of phase 2, you were around this jagged, weird line. You've developed a deep understanding of most everything. You've seen all the concepts by now. Nothing really takes you by surprise. You may get caught up on a specific detail here or there, or you'll realize, ooh, I need to spend more time on that, or shoot, I had that figured out, but I forgot. Those things. Phase 3 is what I call monk mode. This is where you are no longer distracted by low yield information. You are able to clearly identify what I need, what I don't need. You see questions now and you're moving quickly and you're like, yep, highlight, don't need, bam. Identify the answer choices, like, yeah, that's my answer, boom, move on. You are quick now. You're doing summative problems now and you're ironing out details. That's the goal for monk mode. You are now getting ready for full day exam. I think part of the importance of monk mode, as opposed to maybe the prior sections, is that now when you do practice problems, you got to do it on a timer. If you weren't doing it on a timer prior, now you got to do it on a timer. There's like opinions, man, on like if you should use a timer during phases 1 and 2. You know, man, I'm not gonna tell you what to do. I did not use a timer. I was always in tutor mode. If you use UWorld. But again, doesn't matter. Point is, you've got to get up to speed. So I would do my 3 hours of review, and then I went straight into the 40 blocks. So what is a 40 block? A 40 block is 40 questions, randomized, all concepts, all whatevers, and I would do them. And I would do that. And I would learn from it, and I would make Anki cards from it, and then I would do another one, and another one, until it was bedtime. That's what's simple about monk mode. Really, you wake up every day and you've only got 2 things you gotta do. Review yesterday's material, review the compendium of knowledge that you've produced via Anki cards or review sheets or whatever, and then do UWorld questions. And so this is probably the first place I'll say this, but like, now is not the time for the deep dives. Now is not the time to exercise curiosity. It's about progressing forward and building speed and building stamina, and also like ironing out those little details. I love this iron analogy. It's so good. You know, I keep saying iron out details. I should probably give an example. Around this time was the time that like I would see that one question out of 100 that was like leishmaniasis, and I'm like, what? I've never seen, or like juvenile myoclonus epilepsy and those AEDs and their explicit like specific mechanisms for working. You know, those are those details. this is the time to fill those in if you presume they're medium to high yield enough. If they're low yield, forget them. Okay. Shoot, you may be surprised to know that that's really all there is to know about monk move. Well, here we are. Throughout this video, we've given a general overview of a way to approach the learning of Step 1's knowledge, but there are a few things that I haven't yet answered, and you're probably thinking. So, for example, practice tests. When should you do them? How many should you do? Should you do all of them? These are hard questions, and not all of them have clear answers. I'll tell you what I did, and I'll tell you some of my thoughts about them. I did not do all of the NBMEs. I think there's at least one prolific writer on the internet who says, do all of the NBMEs, and I feel like that's a large waste of time. The issue with NBMEs, and you've probably already identified this, is that they're very inefficient. You do the questions, and then you learn some of the questions, and then you don't get perfect explanations for them if you Google around. They're not as effective learning tools as UWorld is, or Kaplan is, or whatever your other question bank sources are. So I don't like doing that many NBMEs. However, I think it's very important and part of the, should be part of the student's arsenal to learn where they're at and see how they're doing. So for me, towards the end of phase 1, like mid-phase, like end of one of the weeks of phase 2, I would do these NBMEs. I think in total I took 3 or 4 NBMEs, and that's including the NBMEs that I did on my practice test days, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. Okay, I've kind of got all the science down, but what about all the logistics and technical details for test day? And so a couple weeks out, I did a Google around. I came across a blog post that said do you know what you're doing in your last 2 weeks of studying? Something to that effect, and I was like, my lord, no, I have no idea what I'm doing in my last 2 weeks. And I recommend you read the blog post in its entirety. I found it to be very insightful and very helpful, and I modeled my last 2 weeks almost, my practice days, completely off of that, and I think to good benefit. What it said was 2 weeks before test day, identify a full day that you're going to essentially do a full test run-through. That's right, that's not just a 4-hour practice test, but a full 7/8 hours of practicing. And so what this does is it will force you to think about all of the logistics for the day. How far away is my test site? Do I know the drive? Do I know if there's parking available? What coffee should I bring? Do I need ibuprofen, Advil, Tylenol? What will I have for breakfast? What snacks am I bringing? I'm a fan of almonds and M&Ms, but I'll leave that thinking for you. What are all of the things I need to pack and prepare? Oh my gosh, how many bathroom breaks do I get? When do I drink water? When do I ingest caffeine? Can I place an IV in my arm? All those details need to be thought about. And so, 2 weeks prior to actual test day, you do a dirty run-through. You start the morning at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. or whenever you need to get up, and you run through the entire process. Farhad, where am I going to get a full-scale test? So this is interesting. As you know, the actual step 1 is 7 sections of about 40 questions, something like that. And you don't have a way of getting 7 clean sections. So what do? This USMLE blog post recommends doing 2 different practice assessments, one an NBME, 4 sections, and another a UWorld self-assessment. And the thinking between mixing and matching is that an NBME will typically underpredict you, and a UWorld self-assessment will typically overpredict you. And you just take an average in between those, and you can kind of call it a day. That's 8 sections. That's a lot of sections. But I assure you, if you've gotten through 7 sections, doing that 8th section will go an extra mile in helping you prepare your stamina, and just have that mental fatigue awareness that you'll need on actual test day. Because again, as I said, the actual test, it's, this whole process is a marathon, but also test day is a marathon. And you want to make sure that you have the mental capacity to push past that 6th block and get through that last section. So I recommend it. I recommend that blog post, but at bare minimum, the concept is this. 2 weeks out or 1 week out, you need a full, dry run-through of your entire process for test day. Do that. So as I said, I did a total of 4 NBMEs, One of them here, one of them here. These were intermixed with UWorld self-assessments, 1 and 2, as you know. And then I did like another NBME or maybe another 2 NBMEs just in the weeks prior. I did those just so that I could see my forward progress and I could see my learning. I think that that's really important, and I'll touch on that in my burnout section in a moment. Let's talk about the day before. The day before, you want to chillax. You should just be pretty cool. You should not do anything that's mentally intensive. Watch a lame movie. Don't watch Inception, for example. Don't do any like heavy studying. I want to go back to like my fundamentals and my wax on, wax off analogy. The day before the test is not the time to try to learn something new. If anything, it is the time to refine your fundamentals, your bare basics. Bare bones basics, fundamentals, foundations, all of the above. Go to the gym, take a shower, take a hot bath. Make sure your morning materials for the next day are ready. Again, for me, that included things like my food, my almonds, M&Ms, ibuprofen, caffeine in whatever form I wanted, a water bottle, my PB&J, whatever. Make sure all these things are ready. Have a good checklist written out. Again, as I mentioned, I'm a little OCPD, so I have like multiple checklists for that day. If you do attempt to study, keep it like really mentally non-intensive. It should be like light flipping through first aid, or like rewatching those sketchy videos you've forgotten 100 times, or going through like your missed questions or your like flagged questions in UWorld. Just don't be intensive, just review lightly. I hope that up until this point everything's been useful for you. Some of you will probably get the urge to be like, great, there's nothing else to see, and dip out of this video. But I do want to take a couple extra moments to talk about something that I think is really important, which is your mental health during this process. I want to talk a little bit about the self-care things that you should be doing, as well as ways of avoiding burnout. So let me start by saying this. This thing's a marathon, as I've mentioned a couple of times, and you don't want like any one day to be like so hard a sprint that the next day it's impossible to get out of bed, or you lose sight of the goal and stuff, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So first and foremost, I think I'll probably draw a list of things here somewhere. Have a good support system. Maybe I'll stand here. Have a good support system. Make sure your friends know that your close medical friends, you're all in this together. Maybe like every 2 or 3 days, text each other, check in and be like, hey, how you doing? Does anyone want to like just vent and cry over the phone? Not that me or my friends cried. We didn't, but we definitely whined. And remember, this is going to be a very mentally fatiguing process. I would highly recommend some type of exercise regimen throughout this entire thing. I didn't mention it during my phases because I don't want to bog you guys down with that extra thinking, but for me, every other day in this like 1 to 2 o'clock time period, I would go to the gym. That was just like a thing I did Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and Saturdays and Sundays sometimes if I felt like it. I found that it was really good. It was time to not think about those things, or maybe do like some light Anki cards while in between sets or something like that. Just trying to keep you healthy and active. I'm just going to like vaguely point in the general direction of the amazing body of research that says that people who are physically active learn and process better and have like overall better like retention of things they do. It's good. I kind of talked about phases 1 through 3 without really giving them specific amounts of time, but now that you're here, I should probably mention. Phase 1 for me was about 3 weeks, but for most people will probably be around 2 to 3 weeks, somewhere in there. You can shorten it up as much as you want. If you're already up at that phase 1 level, maybe you don't need a phase 1 at all. Again, this is meant to be adaptable and flexible. My phase 2, I would recommend about 1.5 to 2 weeks, and for phase 3, another 1.5 to 2 weeks. So if you add those up, that kind of touches around that, does it? Yeah, it does, around 5 to 7 weeks. And so you should know, as a studious medical student, that the evidence for how long is too long to study says around 7 weeks. And so if you're like me and you're thinking about taking extra time, you should be aware. Most, if doing a study of how student scores do for very, very long, intense study sessions over many weeks, Those who went past 6 or 7 weeks started to see a decrease in their scores. There's reasons for that, and the key is, if you're going to go past that 7-week mark, that you take steps to make sure that you don't fall prey to mental fatigue and burnout. And I'll talk about that in my burnout section in just a moment. Yeah, and then I also want to make mention of those really crappy moments. Take a moment. There are times during the study period where you will find yourself completely angry, frustrated, pissed off, frankly, because you're not getting something. You consider it simple, you've seen it 3 times, it's taking you too long, why can't I get this? And you'll find yourself deeply, deeply frustrated. In times like that, you may, I got a good one, like when you do your first NBME and it's like way below what you thought it should be. Wow. It's an eye-opener and it can hurt a lot. And in moments like those, it's very important that you don't go off the deep end. You might think that, no, like I gotta focus on this, or I gotta do this right now, or I gotta take another NBME and I gotta get this and I'll prove to myself I'm good enough, or something like that. If you find yourself in one of these like darker thought loops, or you're really upset with yourself and you're not thinking rationally, you should know that's gonna affect the next 10 questions you do. So what is my point? If ever during the study period you are really stuck, you're fixated, you're really angry, you're burnt out, or anything like that, don't make it worse. Don't do another NBME and get an even lower score. Don't do another 40 questions and tire yourself out more and realize you're even more frustrated because you can't seem to improve even though you've seen this concept for 5 straight questions. Take a step back. You need to stop for your own good, take a step back, recharge, maybe take an evening off, at least go for a walk, wash your face, get a chocolate smoothie, or something to that effect, because you need a moment to reconnect to the broader goal. And I think that's a pretty decent segue into my little bit on burnout. Burnout is a big issue. A lot of us face it in medical school. I think we're very, very prone to it. And I know that you probably get a lot of wellness lectures at your school that discuss burnout, but I don't think any burnout lecture speaks to med students in the way that I'm about to speak to you, which is very practically. I break down the myriad variables that are involved in burnout, and I try to give you them under 2 themes, which I think will apply to us very easily during this study period. So the very first one I think I want to mention is having a goal. You need to have goals on multiple levels to make it through these 7 weeks, and if you're like me, 9 weeks, and to be able to see beyond that. At the longest term, you need to be thinking about your future as a doctor. You need to think about the reason you're doing medicine, the reason you're learning this knowledge. In the most grandiose case, you're thinking about how all of this knowledge is important to the type of like really effective teaching doctor you're going to be for your patients, and blah blah blah. Connect to that as much as you can. On a slightly more realistic scale, you may be thinking about how you need the highest score possible to become the most well-positioned doctor at the best residency or whatever, to be the most effective doctor you want to be. So long as you can connect all of this struggle to a long-term goal, you're setting yourself up for some success, and also to inhibit burnout. But you also need shorter-term goals. On a shorter-term goal, you need something to think about after this step 1 thing is over. The day after step should feel like an incredible weight has been lifted off your back. You have a trip planned, you have a vacation coming, you have significant others or best friends or whatever, and you do something. That's more medium term. On the shortest term goal, I would have at the end of every week, as I told you, I had 2 evenings off every week, Sunday evening and Saturday evening. Every Saturday evening, I had someone to hang out with. I looked forward to that. I had that written up on my whiteboard, so that every time I would like get lost and desolation, isolation, desperation, I would look over at that whiteboard and I would go, I have something to look forward to this weekend. And it would re-energize me, if not for a moment. The reason this side of the goal thing is important, and I'd like to tie it to some real world stuff, is as you may know, emergency physicians actually have the highest, by a little bit, but the highest rate of burnout. And given this side of the goal framework that I just gave you, it makes sense. Emergency physicians don't really have sight of the goal. They are the first line for a lot of the community's problems, but they're also just like a triage in a primary diagnostic space. They then send patients to go to fixed or actually diagnosed or whatever elsewhere in the hospital. As a result, emergency physicians never get to see the results or the goals of their work. Their ED is always a revolving, rotating door of new patients, and they really never get to see the success of their work. Unless, of course, they do something a little bit, more holistic or big scale, like some EM physicians engage the community. But I'm rambling. So, goals. Have them. Long-term, short-term. Good. The other major thing to help avoid burnout is visible progress. Progress is very important. As you do your UWorld blocks, you'll slowly see, those go from like 50% to like 60%, like 65, 70-ish. If you're really good, 80, wow. 90%. That's great. That progress will not always be upward. There will be times when it goes down, like when you switch from cardio to renal or something. It will drop down. There will be days you did like a 85%, you're like, oh my god, I'm a genius, and the next one will be like a 50%. That's just like the game. Progress is really important, but it's also easy to think, and I understand that those 40 questions that you do aren't really representative of what the test looks like. And so that's what those NBMEs were for that we spaced out. Doing an NBME, again, the NBMEs are weird and sometimes their predictions aren't the best, but whatever. The NBMEs are a good way to watch your progress. I will call back to the moment where I said it will not always go up. It may go down, and that may be frustrating. And the answer is not to take another NBME immediately, because you're like emotionally unstable or like triggered or something like that. It won't feel good to do another one. You're also like mentally fatigued. Don't do that to yourself. But bottom line, seeing your progress going forward is very important. If you do not have a sense that you are moving forward, it is very easy to feel like the work that you're doing, the studying that you're doing is meaningless. It's not helping. So you need to be able to connect your work to your progress and results, and be able to assess whether or not you're improving. I think that pretty much closes out for the burnout stuff. So again, most important stuff, have goals in mind that can keep you energized and be able to track your progress. Very important. Next section. As we come to the end of a very long video that hopefully you found useful, I'd like to review a couple of the philosophical concepts, the overlying ideas, and then give you a couple of extra resources and a couple extra tips, my own heuristics, if you will, for approaching certain types of problems. So again, always focus on your weak points. That's how you get the most efficient bang for your buck in terms of studying. Stay as minimal as you can. Don't bog yourself down with too many resources. It's a waste of time in the long run. Keep an eye on progress. As long as you're moving forward, you're moving forward. Doesn't matter how slow, as long as it's phase 1. Doesn't matter how slow, so long as you're moving forward. Learning and a focus on the process is key. Let the daily questions guide your review for the day. Trust in the process. Go with the flow. As long as you're learning, you're learning. Make sure that you can see your progress over time, stuff like that. So let's address some other questions. These are like kind of FAQ type stuff that other people have asked. I think first and foremost, a lot of people ask like, how much time should you spend per phase? Again, I've tried to give you this broad understanding of each phase so that you don't have to set like exact times on these things, so that's flexible. But in general, phase 1, general familiarity. Phase 2, almost there. Phase 3, ironing out the details. A lot of people ask, how many questions should how fast should I be going through problems? I would say a general rule of thumb in both phase 1 and phase 2, hell, all the way across, but like slower earlier on and faster later on, is like 10 questions per hour. I would say in phase 1, when I do these 10 questions, I would like honestly maybe 2 or 3 hours early phase 1. It's all about making sure you're learning while you're going forward. You'll see a question that like like off the bat, you're like, bam, I got this, it's great. Then you'll see the question, you're like, whoa, I am missing a lot of the understanding that it takes to get this right. And so, not trying to be too prescriptive. In general, 10 questions per hour in these earlier phases. By the time I got to phase 3, you know what, I stayed slow pretty much the whole way. As I told you, I didn't finish UWorld. I only did a total of like 1,800 of the UWorld questions, including the self-assessments. And so I was doing about the same rate, honestly, about 4 hours, 40 questions. 1 hour to do the questions, and then the other 3 hours were to learn and review and make Anki cards and review and consolidate and blah, blah, blah. So that's my general heuristic. When you're doing these, if you do these rapid review and the first aid Q&A, that was also, yeah. Well, those were a little bit faster, I think, maybe like 15, 20 questions per hour. Again, so long as you're learning, you're doing fine. Let's see. Let's talk about heuristics. Yeah, these are fun. So oftentimes I would come across a question that I have absolutely no idea, like I'm trying to pick between two and I'm like, crap, you know, how do I pick? So let me give you a heuristic for science questions. Oftentimes I would see a question, I'm between two answers, and I'm like, ugh, it's like, the obvious answer is this, but like maybe I remember that there was like this particular case where it's that. Go with the obvious one. It won't be right every time, but I found that in general, when I found myself second guessing between two things and time is short and I gotta keep moving, the one that came to me first, the go with your gut option, worked out more often than not. If you want, do yourself a randomized trial, but for me that generally worked. For ethics questions, as I mentioned earlier, I'm pretty bad at ethics. Not sure why, but I am. And so when I would see those questions, a heuristic I came up with was just go for the nicest answer. So like the behavioral stuff and the ethics stuff, like I would read the answers and you know there's that answer choice that's like really rude. It's like, tell the patient to go home and not call you again. You're like, oh, that sounds really rude, don't do that. And I would look through and I would be like between two answers again and I would have trouble deciding. I found that more often than not, it was a good bet to say it was probably the one that sounded nicer. Like, you know, buy the patient an ice cream sundae and tell them how it's not their fault that they have daddy issues. I don't know. Whatever the nice answer was, that typically worked out for me. Hopefully you develop your own more advanced heuristics and things that work for you. Basic concepts. This is a test of This is a test of conceptual understanding. If you ever come across a question that you're like, I have never seen this in my life. What is this talking about? Streptococcus illinois? I've never heard of such a thing. That's not in sketchy. What do I do? Remember, take a moment, breathe, and realize this is a test of fundamental concepts. This isn't a test question about strep illinois. Illinois? It's a test about streptococcus. Aha! So if you extrapolate from the most common strep pneumo, you might probably just get it right. It's building on the foundational concepts. This is a conceptual test. Your ability to extrapolate a little bit based on the foundations you know will go a long way. Remember the wax on, wax off mode of thinking. Another example to address this point is maybe you get like a question that says, there's a new small vessel vasculitis identified. What do you think like patients might present with? And you're like, shoot, you haven't told me anything about it, or whatever. But you know that most small vessel vasculitides, yes, vasculitides, most of them present with like skin damage or like kidney disease or something like that. And as a result, you could probably extrapolate to this newfound vasculitis or something like that, okay? Those are some general thoughts on that. I would like to take a moment and appreciate some like supplemental resources that I found to be super helpful. I will put them up on the screen or toss them out in the description below. Board review series, ethics. I'm bad at ethics. I read this book and I read a couple chapters of that book in like a day, and it was very helpful. The Osmosis series of videos on YouTube, amazing. A great way to dive deep across the spectrum of like pathology, diagnosis, treatment, etc. for lots of diseases, lots of concepts. Love it, Osmosis. Thank you for your work. Another great primary source website was Medico Awesome. I'll leave a link somewhere. That is a great website. I think it's mostly managed by like international medical graduates or students, and they have like an infinite number of mnemonics and frameworks and ways of thinking about concepts. Very, very, very frequently, I found myself coming to a concept that I was like, how do I remember this? Somewhere, someone smarter than me took the time to think up a clever mnemonic. For example, I remember having trouble with the what are they called? The pregnancy markers, the AFPs, the HCGs, the inhibins, etc. And there's a way to remember these fetal markers on that website. Another great one, MedBullets, I've mentioned a few times. MedBullets is like basically like an online version of first aid, the way I think about it. Really great, sometimes good questions, sometimes good like cases at the top, very helpful. Some secondary review resources. I love Anki. I would say one Anki deck no one should go without is the Groovernaculum Rapid Review Deck. Google around for it. I may drop a link somewhere. Some books that also were very cool in like synthesizing hard concepts were the Step 1 Secrets book. I don't remember if that's his exact title. I'll drop a link somewhere. Last but not least, just like some idiosyncratic random things about me. I love studying off of a big screen, so I like brought in like a semi-medium size HD TV, put it in my room, and hooked up the HDMI cable from my laptop, and I just like enjoyed studying off like a projector-sized screen. Just something about it made it feel more important, made me less likely to procrastinate and like open other tabs, as though I was like learning from a big screen. I don't know, it felt good. Also, get a whiteboard. If you're like me, you might like writing concepts and feeling important and like, you know, going through the motions of like practicing concepts and concept maps, whatever, on a whiteboard. I found it very helpful. I found it helpful to track my progress, to write like important things and reminders, and like remember my philosophical points, blah, 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 and like write motivational quotes to myself, you know, whatever. Get a whiteboard if you want. And that is everything. That is every thought I have on step 1. And so for those of you who've made it all the way to the end and watched like everything, thank you. I hope you learned something from it. I hope that these overlying methodologies and frameworks for thinking about how to study during this time has been of some use to you. I hope that it's made you feel more comfortable going into the step study period, that there's no one best model, and that really anything will work so long as you're progressing and you're learning and you keep sight of the goals at the end of the road. It's all good. If you found this helpful, if you found it insightful, please, I'm gonna hate saying this, share on Facebook, click that like button, show it to your friends. I'm really hoping just to help as many medical students as possible. I remember this time was a very dark time in mine and my friends' lives, and I'm just trying to minimize that as much as possible for all of you out there. Once again, thank you for watching, and I wish you the best of luck on your exams.